And the individual who will lead by example at the start will be Kenny MacAskill.
It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Chair Hollowburn, and I first of all pay tribute to the member for Folkestone and Hythe. It wasn't just a very wide-ranging speech, but I thought it was remarkably interesting, indeed and very erudite, and I congratulate him for bringing all those aspects to our attention, and I concur with him. We are in difficult times, and it is important that we do hold power to account and that truth will out. And equally, to ensure that, we require to ensure that those who are seeking to report it, who are seeking to expose it, often malevolent and certainly often under difficult circumstances, are protected. It's why I pay tribute to the names that he mentioned, but it would also put on record the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was sadly murdered by Israeli Defence Forces not that long ago. And I was glad to see actually on Al Jazeera News at breakfast time this morning that this matter is being pursued by that organisation, a news organisation, to the International Criminal Court. But I think the comments I want to make relate to our own country, because we are not immune either in the UK or indeed in Scotland. We are in a better position than what is happening in Israel with regard to the Palestinians and those who seek to report it. We're in a better position, obviously, than what is happening in the Ukraine. But we are by no means a paragon of virtue, and we do have to ensure that we uphold the standards here, which brings me to the case of Julian Assange, that I know that others will be commenting on in particular as well. But it is important because Mr. Assange has brought power to account. He has exposed war crimes, as well as a lot of other malevolent actions, not simply by the USA, but other governments, including our own, but also, as I'll go on to comment, the government of Sweden. So we have to be prompt there. I read with interest the book I think all MPs were sent by Niels Meltzer, The Trial of Julian Assange. I have to say I did not know of Mr Meltzer before. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. But he narrated his journey to conclusions about Julian Assange, and where he speaks out vehemently against it. And I have to say I shared his positions, because when I first heard of Julian Assange, I was surprised. There was reporting of a sex misdemeanour in Sweden. Sweden's a country I knew well. One of my best friends in Edinburgh was the Swedish Consul General. I still keep in touch with him, though he's returned. My son had studied 2 years in Gothenburg, not at the Chalmers University, a legacy of Scottish immigrants there, but indeed at the University of Gothenburg. I was a big fan and remain a big admirer of Swedish social democracy and indeed of Olof Palme. Surely this could not have happened in Sweden. Surely Sweden wouldn't be involved in anything that was duplicitous or wrong. And the sad thing is it was. Clearly Sweden has now exonerated, and the conclusions against Mr Assange here have come to an end. You do have to draw some conclusion that Mr Assange did expose that the Swedish security services were in fact narrating that they were doing things and cooperating with the USA in a manner that their government did not know about and that their government would not probably approve of, which may have had something to do with it. But what occurred with regard to Mr Assange in Sweden was shameful, and the United Kingdom is being both supine and indeed sadly complicit in his return to the United States. He has committed no offence in the United States other than to expose their war crimes. The United States has given an assurance that they will not execute him, but we know from the attitude of the United States that Mr Assange is unlikely to see the light of day from a federal prison if he's sent there, and indeed, given his current state of health, he is unlikely to survive. It is simply unacceptable that we should have had the collusion that has been ongoing by the UK government through the Ecuadorian embassy with the United States, and indeed even the United States contemplating a hit job, to put it in their parlance, upon Mr Assange in this country. That is simply unacceptable. Equally, I have to say, we have to challenge some of the media reporting in this country, because I too was shocked when I saw Mr Assange looking like some wild man of Borneo being brought out of the Ecuadorian embassy. It did challenge your assumptions about who this person could be. It's somebody who was so dishevelled, somebody that would keep their appearance like that. How could you possibly have any faith or trust in them? And it was only when I read the book and I realised that he had been detained and the government of Ecuador had changed and the attitude of the Ecuadorian government and administration had changed, and they had refused to allow in cleaning equipment. They had refused to allow in and access to scissors or indeed shaving equipment. Mr Assange was like that, not because he chose to appear like that, because he was being deliberately set up so when he was released or forced out of the Ecuadorian embassy, he would look in a manner that people would immediately be aghast and turn against him. That was deliberate manipulation of the media, which is just as bad as a failure to report the truth. I would like to say, I'm conscious of time in the comments that you made, Mr Chair, that my own country was exempt. I served as 20 years as a defence agent in Scotland and I'm proud of Scotland's distinctive criminal justice system and indeed its legal system. I also served for almost 8 years as Justice Secretary. But there's something gone fundamentally wrong, not with regard to Julian Assange, but with the situation of Craig Murray. Craig Murray spent 6 months or almost in a Scottish prison. He did so for a reporting offence which others who did similarly were not punished for or even brought before the court. I leave that aside as it's something he will seek to raise with courts in Europe as an appeal in Scotland is precluded. But the logic taken by Lady Dorian, the presiding judge, and the actions taken by the prosecutors in Scotland was fundamentally wrong. They take the view, and they took the view, that the mainstream media was all perfect. Well, given what I've mentioned about Mr Assange, you have to wonder about that. But that those who are bloggers were in a different category and should be treated differently. But we are, as the mover of this motion correctly said, in a world where it's changed on. There are obviously issues with regard to Twitter and social media platforms where anonymous sources, and the points made about Vax are quite correct, they cannot be given any basis, support or substance. But indeed, Mr Assange was quite clear in his facts. They were checked, everything was there. Mr Murray was doing something not dissimilar to what others had done, and yet he was signalled and picked out. What her ladyship seemed to be suggesting was that there could be no situation or cut or guarantee given to them, and that somehow or other the mainstream press were to be protected, given that most of the incidents that we have had of people seeking recompense have come from the mainstream press, in terms of damage claims or whatever, have come from the mainstream press, not from bloggers like Mr Murray or Mr Assange. That raises questions. But it has to be an acceptance that our society moves on. Just over 100 years ago, papers were closed down by the British government because they were viewed as subversive during World War I. They became mainstream because the Independent Labour Party were elected to power. The paper that was the voice of the Independent Labour Party was subscribed to by my parents. The logic of Lady Dorian would be that that paper could not be a legitimate enterprise because it wasn't part of the mainstream press. It was legitimate almost immediately after the 2 weeks it had been closed down for. It had been legitimate because it had been bought by many before then. And all I say that is because things move on. We live in a world where people don't buy newspapers, and I say that with some sadness, as I'm a fan of papers and write for them. People do go to online sites, and those people who go through online sites who are legitimate, not the chancers or putting in disinformation, require the protection. So it's right to challenge this. We have to ensure that we protect media and truth throughout the world, but we have to look to ourselves. The case of Mr Assange is a shame upon the United Kingdom, and the case of Craig Murray is a shame upon the current government and judiciary in Scotland.